To review briefly, in the first lecture for Lesson 2, we developed graphic models of the impact of supply shocks and of consumption shocks on the market. The models predict a price response that changes the behavior of consumers and suppliers in ways that mitigate increased scarcity in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Higher prices give consumers an incentive to conserve and give producers an incentive to bear the higher costs of providing more chainsaws, ice, plywood, strawberry Pop-Tarts, whatever's in short supply. We also analyzed the issue of price gouging, an issue that you'll examine in more detail in the computer activity accompanying this lesson. We compared how producers respond in price allocation to their response in the alternative scenario of rationing by standing in line, noting that there's nothing about lines of angry people that motivates producers to bear the extra cost of supplying more. We also identified the consumer response to controlling prices and allocating by lines to be hoarding, noting that while hoarding rarely gets the attention or emotionalism attached to accusations of price gouging, it's nonetheless a real phenomenon, and it's a problem that is stubbornly resistant to non-market incentives like appeals to our better natures. This wry analysis by Michael Salinger, director of the Economics Bureau of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, reminds me of the classic Gary Larson dog cartoon. He said, quote, "Hoarding behavior is real. One might think that when a shortage looms, the governor of the state, or perhaps the president, should urge people not to stock up unnecessarily. But when politicians say, there is no reason to stock up, what citizens hear is, there's every reason to stock up." One of the answers to the question of markets can do when disaster strikes was that they efficiently communicate information in the form of prices that helps individual decision makers adjust to increased scarcity. In this lecture, then, we want to look more carefully at the supplier side of the market, using studies of recent disasters to check out the predictions of the graphic model. So go back for a minute to the model of the market. What do we know about the mechanics of market supply that allows us to predict that the unorchestrated private enterprise will respond positively and effectively to disaster shocks? Price communicates the information, right, but what ensures the desired business response? You've got it. The good old invisible hand. Competition and the profit motive provide the incentives for businesses to address the increased scarcity. In fact, some analysts have proposed that while natural disasters force significant change of perspective on consumers, they can be seen as just more intense period of business as usual for most producers. The director of the Business Roundtable comments that solving problems is what businesses do. In an echo of Hayek, Johannes Schneider argues that the constant presence of competition, quote, prepares business to adapt to changing circumstances. The world that producers and sellers live in every day is one of rapidly changing demand, and being profitable means being able to adapt and anticipate. In that sense, decision-making in disaster may represent a change in magnitude for businesses, but certainly not a change in type. The incentives that motivate market response in normal times, profit and self-interest, continue to operate in disasters, and as in normal times, they work to reduce the impact of scarcity. And don't underestimate the strength of this profit motive. The incentive to respond to consumers' wants and needs is often magnified by a disaster because the reality is that the early responders make the most profit, and there's lots of profit to be made. The rewards are, in fact, large enough to induce businesses to plan for the next disaster and to bear higher costs in order to do so. We see this phenomenon revealed in many ways. Who knew, for example, that there is actually a disaster preparedness industry whose customers are often private businesses investing in plans and preparations for responding to the profit opportunities of the next disaster? Check your phone book or Google disaster preparedness on the web. You may be surprised at the list of providers. A second competitive response by business is the incentive to collect and use information that no one else is likely to collect, so that they're prepared to answer questions that most of us would never think of until after the disaster strikes. We saw some of this in the Nobody Knows Everything game in our last lecture. Walmart's purchase tracking system revealed what is to us the surprising fact that strawberry Pop-Tarts fly off the shelves after a disaster. Well, sure, you say, that's not rocket science. Pop-Tarts don't spoil, they come in small packages, they're easy to feed kids. Well, I'd reply, that's easy for you to say after the fact. But the important thing is that Walmart already had the information and was prepared to respond. So, here's another question we could have added to our game. Who is Lucas McDonald? Give up? He's a meteorologist, a full-time employee of Walmart's emergency management department. Who knew Walmart had its own weatherman? And lest we think that Walmart made a lucky guess or that this was some sort of anomaly, Hurricane Katrina provides us with a lengthy list of private companies responding in anticipation of the needs of hurricane victims. FedEx used computer analysis of possible destruction scenarios to chart alternate delivery routes in preparation for resuming operations after the hurricane passed. Black & Decker paid workers overtime to work an extra shift over Labor Day weekend. Can you say double pay? They were producing generators which were then shipped to stores immediately outside the predicted hurricane strike area. Home Depot transferred store inventories to increase the supply of generators, flashlights, batteries, and lumber in distribution areas closer to New Orleans. And State Farm insurance adjusters were ready to travel to pre-booked hotel rooms close to the predicted path. You can read about these and other examples of business response in the lesson outline and in the case studies. And the list doesn't include the news stories of private individuals who saw the chance to make some extra money, or even just to cover their costs of being compassionate, and they loaded up their pickup trucks with bottled water or plywood or generators. Bottom line is profit is a magnet, and it pulls needed goods and services into disaster zones. Besides the immediate profit possibilities, businesses are not blind to the long-term impact of effective disaster response on the bottom line. I was struck by this effusive reaction from a Katrina weary Mississippi resident as makeshift stores finally opened in parking lots and tents. There's no doubt in my mind that she and her neighbors will shop happily in Walmart and Sonic and Rite Aid for years to come. She said, quote, "We were all thrilled. Oh, we can go buy pop or we can get essentials. So we were really happy about that. That was a forward motion. And then Sonic opened. We had the busiest Sonic in the whole United States. Amazing. It was like fine dining. Oh, this is wonderful, because there was nothing else then. There was no stores. There was nothing that was even halfway resembling normal. I guess when businesses open up and they start being fully operational, it reminds us what normalcy used to be like. Like Rite Aid opened and it was 100% Rite Aid. I didn't go in to buy anything. I just went to walk around and be normal. Along these same lines, we don't have to be cynical to note that having a reputation for being charitable can be very good for profits. Nor does it denigrate the motives of individual business people to point out that community involvement and stepping up in a disaster can provide an edge in the competitive marketplace. The evidence tells us that businesses are, and have been throughout history, actively involved in disaster relief. In the first 2 weeks following Hurricane Katrina, corporations donated more than $200 million in cash and supplies. Others suspended interest and finance payments on auto and home loans of the victims. More recently, the Business Civic Leadership Center compiled a list of private responders to Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, including British Petroleum, which donated $8 million to community centers in Texas and Louisiana and matched the relief donations of its employees. Or Best Buy, which collected cash donations from customers and matched them up to $1 million. Much smaller than Best Buy or BP, even Kraft Foods donated $150,000 worth of food supplies to the Red Cross. Now that's a lot of free mac and cheese. And the list goes on. It reveals two interesting points for our study. First, it reinforces that the profit motive doesn't preclude and may in fact encourage businesses acting to promote social well-being. Second, as you check the list of corporate and business charities, note that the businesses don't step into the relief offering arena themselves. Instead, they send cash and supplies to the nonprofit agencies who know how to do the job efficiently and effectively. And we'll have some more on this in lessons 3 and 4. Despite the evidence, distrust of the market mechanism's ability to produce social gain persists. Partly, this results from the erroneous belief that profit-making is a zero-sum game, the idea that business gains are evidence of consumer losses. This distrust is heightened in times of disaster. Many people seem to fear that disaster-induced price increases are kind of piling on, taking advantage of misfortune to amass greater profits and prolong victimization of the affected populace. But historical evidence suggests the opposite. Markets are a positive sum game, and the market response to disaster is instrumental in speeding up the return to normal conditions. Lesson 2 contains a case study of the housing market in the Great Chicago Fire. Not until the 20th century would the federal government begin to take a role in disaster relief, so Chicago in 1871 can be used as an unwitting laboratory experiment addressing the question of what markets can do well in disasters. University of Chicago graduate student Dendy McCauley scoured newspapers, advertisements, public and business records in an effort to ascertain the role that markets played in Chicago's remarkable recovery after the Great Fire destroyed half the property value of the city and left over a third of the population homeless. McCauley also found that yes, significant price changes did occur as the rental and boarding markets reacted to both the supply shock, rooms, houses, and apartments destroyed by the fire, and consumption shock, the influx of workers in addition to the returning residents whose homes had been destroyed. But the price jumps were short-lived and rapidly succumbed to downward pressure as rebuilding proceeded. Rather than imposing long-term hardship, the changing prices affected a reallocation of resources that quickly allowed the city to recover and citizens to resume their normal activities. Among McCauley's findings, 2 months after the fire, rental prices jumped 40% above the pre-fire upward trend. But by September 1872, only 11 months after the fire and 9 months after the post-fire high, rental rates returned to the long-term trend. She also found that the Chicago Tribune estimated that by October 16th, a mere 8 days after the fire, 60,000 residents had left the city, but over half of them returned within a few weeks. Added to their demand for temporary housing was the demand by workers who flooded into the city as rebuilding began. Boarding rates jumped 60%, but, as with the rental prices, they returned to pre-fire trends within a year. Now, are McCauley's findings an anomaly resulting from some unique characteristics of the Chicago disaster? Well, both historical and contemporary evidence suggests no. For example, the Dallas Federal Reserve's study of the gasoline market in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and Rita in 2005 reveals similar results: a price spike followed by a reallocation of resources and a rapid return to the pre-disaster price levels. The graph on the screen indicates that as much as 70% of Gulf Coast refining capacity was shut down. Note that the graph shows closed refining capacity, so the upward spikes are not a good thing for those of us who purchase gasoline. You may remember the fears of a gasoline crisis and the alarmist news coverage as reporters scrambled to find, quote, outrageous prices and predicted gasoline shortages. What happened? Well, first, prices did rise, an average of 51 cents per gallon over the 10 weeks following the storm. But the predicted long lines and crisis shortages never materialized. As the Fed reports, there was no widespread debilitating shortage of gasoline, and despite isolated reports of $4 and $6 per gallon, the U.S. generally experienced little disruption, and certainly nothing that could be called a gasoline crisis. Within weeks, in fact sometimes within days, prices fell again. The Fed's report, which you'll read in more detail in the assignments for this lesson, goes on to explain how the rising prices reallocated resources in the face of increased scarcity, as is seen on the chart on the screen. But the bottom line is that, as in the Chicago fire, markets did what they do best. They used prices to communicate the information that buyers and sellers need to make choices when conditions of scarcity change. Thinking ahead to Lesson 3, it's also interesting to note that government played an important role in preventing a post-Katrina gas crisis. Paradoxically, it did so by choosing not to take an active role and to step out of the way, implicitly recognizing markets' institutional fit to the problem. Historical surveys suggest that rapid recovery in market-driven economies is not unusual. The average is about 18 months to the resumption of normal activity. Adding evidence to support the contention that what markets do well when disaster strikes is to help us deal effectively with the resultant increase in scarcity. Or, as Friedrich Hayek pointed out so long ago, they help us, quote, adapt to the particular circumstances of time and place. Our discussion of what markets do well should certainly not be taken to imply that they do everything well, or that there is no role for disaster for other institutions. The inference throughout this lesson that government doesn't perform the reallocation tasks well is inescapable, and it's not unintended. But it should not be taken as an argument that government has no role when disaster befalls its citizens. The problem is identifying from the many things government can do, the things it should do and can be expected to do well. In Lesson 3, we'll turn our attention to the institutional incentives and rules of the game that shape the ability of government to respond to natural disasters.